You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. Hi, my name is Abraham, and I'm not an alcoholic.
Hi, my name is Shane, and I'm court ordered to be here.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do and the things animals do, and sometimes we talk about the ways that we try and help other humans when they're in struggling times.
Yes, and today is part of our suite on our series on addictions and all the things that go along with that. And we are going to talk about the one thing that I think a lot of us have maybe heard about, which is Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yes.
An intervention program for folks that struggle with alcohol abuse.
Yeah, so as we're unpacking our understanding of addiction and treatment around addiction and various aspects of policy around addiction, which will be in future episodes, it seemed like a really appropriate first stop is like, what do most people think of when they're even thinking about addiction? And I think one of the first things is Alcoholics Anonymous. So we need to dive into this, understand where it came from, the research behind it, and where it's going to some extent.
Right.
And, unpack some myths. I think really dig into the things that people may or may not know about how it works. But otherwise, it's worth understanding psychologically what's going on with Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah, I mean, we already did an episode on alcohol specifically and what it does. So this will not cover that so much. This will cover just kind of this intervention program that people kind of go to as part of their treatment package or as part of maybe people recommend this all the time. So, but we'll get into some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think arguably if you were to go back and listen to our archive, if you haven't been with us the whole time anyway, you would find that we've spent a lot of our time talking about sleep and drugs.
Yep.
I think that makes up those two topics get the lion's share of the number of episodes dedicated to those topics.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but I think
me neither.
But here we are.
Though.
Yeah, we should probably maybe just do an episode where we evaluate why we talk about sleep and drugs so much.
We could do it maybe like an anniversary. Anyway, if you like what you hear today and you would like to support us, you can join us on Patreon. You can pick up some merch. You can leave us a rating and a review. You can tell a friend about us. You can do all kinds of things like that and more. And I will talk about that at the end of this discussion today. But first, I would like to welcome you here. Thanks for being here. And if you are joining us on the day that this publishes, which is April 3rd, then we'd like to wish you a happy American Circus Day.
I just went to the circus. It was animal free, and it seemed like it was a lot of fun.
Nice.
It also don't go to work unless it's fun day, so that means everybody's quitting their jobs.
Yes, the employers love that one.
Yeah.
It is Find a Rainbow Day. I think you're going to have better luck if you can find rain first.
Yeah.
But yeah, Find a Rainbow Day.
Yeah. It's also Fish Fingers and Custard Day. I didn't even bother to look this up. I have no idea what it is or what it means.
Yeah, moving on. It is Global Day of the Engineer. I tell you what, we do take for granted the fact that our lives are made possible by engineers.
Yes.
Like, we would live in a very different world if we did not have that incredibly essential profession. So definitely go buy a drink or a snack or thank an engineer for them doing the work that they do.
Yeah, we've all seen Prometheus, so we have the engineers to thank for even being here to begin with. So
Nice.
It's National Chocolate Mousse Day, which I am a big fan of that dessert.
Yeah, you can find the mousse in Canada often. So
The chocolate chocolate brown mousse.
All right, it is National Day of Hope.
Aw, it's National Film Score Day, so go listen to Oh Brother Where Art Thou, because that is the best soundtrack of any movie ever.
Wow. It is National Walking Day. Huge fan of that.
Yeah, it's also Golden Rule Week, so be nice to everyone.
International Dark Sky Week.
Scary.
Maybe make your sky dark. I don't know what to do with that one, but Dark Sky Week, sure.
Yeah, it sounds scary. It's also Laugh at Work Week, so for those of you who are having fun today, go enjoy an entire week of laughing there.
I guess that makes sense with don't go to work unless it's fun.
Yeah.
To some extent. National Bake Week. Does this have anything to do with the Great British Bake Off? I think it might. I don't know.
I hope so, because that show is just so wholesome and wonderful. It's also Testicular Cancer Awareness Week, so that's a big deal. Pay attention to your balls.
It is National Pickleball Month, although given the trends lately, I'm wondering if it's National Pickleball Decade, but we're at least in the month.
My neighborhood wants to build a pickleball court, and I'm like, why would you do that? It's a trend.
You live in Florida. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Anyway, it's Limb Loss and Limb Difference Awareness Month.
Oh, that's good. That maybe is a little bit harder with the walking day, but you can have prosthetics and cadavers and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is National Brunch Month. So just for the month of April, you can have brunch. Otherwise, it's out.
Mimosas for everyone. It's also National Volunteer Month, so go do some good work for free.
It is also National Autism Awareness Month. Yay.
Yay.
And finally, a very important one is it is Prevent Child Abuse Awareness.
Yes.
Awareness of preventing child abuse. It's Prevent Child Abuse Month, April is. So,
yes.
Yeah, always important. Don't abuse children.
Yep, 100%. I think that's a mantra of the podcast.
Yes. And it's not like sometimes don't abuse children. It's like never, ever abuse children.
Never the times.
Like,
never.
Yeah. Usually we like to say what you should do instead. What you should do is not abuse them.
Yeah. You should treat children with love and kindness. Do not abuse them.
Treat them with love and kindness. Yes. Be compassionate. You have a blanket, like don't ever do this sort of thing. Those can be useful rules. And that's a good one.
Yeah. I think
anyway.
So.
We spent a lot of time on that. We need to dive into our topic, which, as we said, is Alcoholics Anonymous. So thank you so much for being here. Let's start talking about the history of, well, before we even get into the history, we need to unpack a little bit of the background of Alcoholics Anonymous and even alcoholism.
Yes. So alcoholism is attributable to 3.3 million deaths every year. This number is 10 times higher than the number of fatalities that every other drug combined has caused. So this is a major concern. Alcohol is one of the most powerful, most destructive, and most dangerous substances that we have ever created. And we say one of. We do know about fentanyl, so when you go to reach out and say that, we are very well aware of that. But alcohol is a very costly thing, as we're seeing here.
Yeah, a lot of deaths can be attributed to alcohol, not necessarily alcoholism every time, but to alcohol for sure. Mm-hmm. This was surprising to me because there's more research that has been coming out on this, and even research into babies that were born to like crack addicted mothers do not seem to have the kind of challenges that we thought that they might. But when you see babies who are born with FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, often or usually they suffer extremely debilitating neurological disruptions that result in lifelong need for additional therapeutic and medical interventions. It seems like even some of the drugs we would consider some of the hardest, worst, most intense drugs are not even as bad in multiple ways as what we've seen alcohol do.
I mean, my experience, I don't know if you've had this experience, but my experience is I've worked with more learners with fetal alcohol syndrome than I have with any other substance abuse issue as a result of their development. So that is something I see consistently. I've worked a lot with folks that have FAS.
Yeah, it's pretty profound, and I think that speaks to. I mean, you certainly. I think the skeptical listener will hear this and say, "Yeah, well, there's a lot more alcohol around. It's a lot more readily consumed," which is definitely true, and that would be part of it. But it also seems like the cases where there are children who are born to mothers who are addicted to other substances, they just don't seem to have as severe problems in most of these cases as the children born to parents who used alcohol while they during pregnancy.
Right.
That being said, like it's not. We don't advocate you take any drugs, as part of, having or raising a child. So it's generally not a successful recipe to ensure success for that individual.
Right.
But it does seem like alcohol might be one of the worst that you could.
Right, absolutely. So today we are talking about this treatment, a program called Alcoholics Anonymous. You'll hear it sometimes abbreviated as Al-Anon or AA. And so this is currently the most well-known addiction treatment program in the United States. Like it's in kind of like it's in the lexicon, it's in common discussions around treatment, drug treatment. And so I think it's a pretty popular thing, but what is it and where did it come from?
Yeah, and I will say, as we're jumping into the more of the background here, it is implemented in countries around the world, but I don't know how well known it is in those other countries relative to its inescapably ubiquitous nature in the United States, where you can like be court ordered to attend this program,
right?
Which is not a federally run program. So it's not super common to have it be the case that the court can sort of specifically recommend an intervention that they have no say in how that intervention is being implemented.
Right.
But nevertheless, there it is. So let's talk about where Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, came from.
A Wall Street professional named Bill Wilson, also love it, William Wilson or Bill Wilson. I like to mix that up. So Bill Wilson was a serious alcoholic in 1934, but it's important to consider that Prohibition ended in 1933, so we're not sure how to interpret that. But as we'll see when we get into the War on Drugs episode, spoiler alert, alcohol consumption did not decrease at all during Prohibition, just so you know that.
Definitely not for Bill Wilson.
Definitely not for Bill Wilson. So alcohol was ruining his life.
Yeah, so he was aware that it was getting pretty out of control, and then he met another addict, Dr. Bob Smith, in 1935 while attending a non-alcoholic spiritual fellowship called the Oxford Group. And so in 1935, they're both in Akron, Ohio, and they meet each other, and they have these similar values, similar ideas. And so in 1935 is when they found Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, they founded it. They began the program.
Right. And so through this program, Wilson is able to maintain his sobriety. He saw alcoholism as a disease of emotions, mind, and body outside of his control. And I think that kind of framing is going to come back a little bit when we start talking about this more.
Yeah, definitely. Pretty central to the whole program here. So essentially, through the program, and part of what he attributes to him being successful is that he shared his experiences with others, his experiences struggling with alcohol. He shared them with other people who were struggling with alcoholism. And he found that both helped him maintain his sobriety, and it helped those other people achieve and maintain sobriety. And so he just wanted to share and expand his strategies to help people that were struggling with addiction to alcohol specifically.
Right. So Wilson and Dr. Smith, they worked together to form the 12 steps of AA, and several more groups formed. And pretty quickly, I mean, we're talking, this started in 1935. In 1939, they published the AA book.
Yes.
4 years. They've got a book and a program.
Yeah, and the programs were starting to pop up all over the country. There was a lot of traction for it. A lot of people were signing up for these, so they were gaining a lot of members. And this is a totally nonprofit organization, right? They wanted to have this be as accessible as they possibly could. And so in the book that they published, they outline the whole program and all of that. And then comes with that is the 12 steps that you maybe have heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I think a lot of people will have heard 12 steps and associate that correctly with AA, right, but not necessarily know what all those 12 steps are. So let's go ahead and just read the list of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous in order, 1 through 12.
Yep, let's do that. So step 0 is ads.
All right, we're back from the ads. We can actually do the real 12 steps now. All right, step 1. We admit we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. I've also saw this wrote in a more sort of perfect past tense, that we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol. Our lives had to become unmanageable. But yeah, so step 1, we admit we're powerless.
Yep. Step 2 is we have come to believe that a power greater than ourselves should restore us to sanity.
Step 3, we make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him.
Capital H him. Step 4 is we have made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves.
Step 5, admitted to God, ourselves, and to other human beings the exact nature of our wrongs.
Step 6 is we were entirely ready to have God remove all of these defects of character.
Step 7, humbly ask him, God, to remove our shortcomings.
Yep. Step 8 is to make a list of all the persons we have harmed and become willing to make amends to them all.
Step 9, make direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others.
Yeah. Step 10 is we continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admit it. So we have to kind of say, oh, this is what's going on. I'm going to admit that I messed up.
Step 11, seek through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out.
And then step 12 is that we have a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. We try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs.
Okay, there was definitely a theme I picked up on in those 12 steps.
Yeah, a little bit, and we'll unpack that.
Okay, so although AA was founded in response to alcohol abuse, people with other drug addictions may attend this. I think that's a common question maybe people may have is like, is this only for alcohol? It was founded with the intention of supporting people with alcoholism, but people with other substance abuse disorders certainly have shown up and are welcome to show up to these meetings if they wish.
Yes, and AA is and always has been deeply rooted in Christian faith. If you did not pick up on that theme as we were going through the steps, it's pretty clear there's a lot of capital H's in there. But nevertheless, criticisms of the overt religiosity of the group apparently led them to adopting the terminology higher power more often than God specifically. So there was a little bit of a switch to that term higher power from God because of some of the criticisms of that.
So I imagine that some of this was rewritten to be something like, make a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care of a higher power as we understood it, or something like that.
Right.
Is probably how many of those have been a little bit rephrased. Now, reportedly, this idea of a higher power, which is fairly ambiguous, there was one AA member who decided that doorknobs were a higher power and that praying to doorknobs would help him achieve sobriety and keep it. And allegedly that this was a real belief that he had. And you know, I was thinking about it and I was like, that does seem silly and kind of weird, but it's really not that different to like praying to some invisible sky wizard, except that doorknobs are real.
You know, I was reading that note and I was like, that feels like sarcasm, like not that last part, but like I was like that story feels like it's made up, and apparently
right?
It's not.
It does,
because like it's so hard sometimes when I read your notes. I'm like, did Abraham make that up? Usually when we get to the end, I'm like, okay. So anyway, we're good now.
That was a report that I found, at least. Yeah.
Hey, listen, sometimes that's what happens when we do our research. We find these tidbits, these nuggets of interesting things.
Yeah.
Now, it is free to anyone. Anyone who wishes to use it can join in. New members are recommended to attend 3 straight months of meetings to develop new habits, to receive advice from veterans, and practice the steps of the program. 90 meetings in 90 days. That's also part of this too.
Yeah, they're encouraged to actually attend meetings for the rest of their life, essentially. But the strong recommendation, the like, this is the dose that's required to get yourself into a sober lifestyle, from AA at least, is 3 months. So they want the 90 days. I don't know why they didn't go for 7, since the theme and all, but there it is. Maybe they thought that was too much.
Yeah, they were like too bad. So, but it's interesting though, like I think about that and I'm like, just from a purely behavioral standpoint, like creating a new routine and getting into a habit for that long would be interesting to see, like its maintenance, right? Like if I start a habit and I get into a habit, like, and I do that same thing for 90 days, I would imagine I would build a pretty strong habit and become fluent in that pretty quickly,
Yeah, absolutely. We will get into, I think, the parts of this that are probably somewhat effective.
Right.
Another, I think, piece of understanding Alcoholics Anonymous is the anonymous part of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that may seem fairly obvious, but it's worth asking, like, what does that mean to say that it's Alcoholics Anonymous? Because you go to these meetings, people can see the faces of the other people there. The people can see you when you're there, and you hear the stories about the attendees that visit AA group meetings. So like there is that part, but what's anonymous about it, or what's supposed to be going on here, is that each member is told not to disclose their full name or any identifying information. And this is really founded in the belief that if people can remain anonymous, they will feel more safe and open and more willing to share their experiences without fear or judgment or retaliation, from anybody who might hear it. And further, it is meant to create some amount of sort of equality and equity between members so that they're not behaving with respect to their social status or lack thereof. They're not there like defending or participating with respect to their wealth, their fame, or really anything else that could get in the way of their ability to listen and share. So it's really meant to say the thing we have in common is the important reason why we're here. So whatever else is going on in your life does not need to be the thing that's influencing your ability to participate in these meetings.
Yeah, and I actually think that that's a pretty decent sentiment when you consider that the
Sure.
value is like keeping people safe and trying to give everybody an equal playing field, because I think there's something really nice about that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
That's my thought. But it is difficult to imagine how well it works to remain anonymous. So we kind of talked about that idea in that issue. We have heard the stereotypical introduction of the meeting. Hello, my name is blank, and I'm an alcoholic, often shared by extremely personal stories that will also be situated to some extent around that person's specific context, which will likely include their status. So there's going to be some information that comes up as a result of that. Someone sharing about sleeping under a bridge gives a lot away about their financial status, as does someone sharing about missing their private jet to France because they drank too much. I mean, there's context clues that kind of unlevel the playing field a little bit as you kind of explore this.
Yeah. So the extent to which that part of it works, unclear. But the process of AA involves several important steps, and these will become very relevant as we start to unpack the components and their relative potential for effectiveness in the extent to which people who attend AA are successful through the program. And the first one, as we said, is that people attend regular meetings with other people in which they report on their continued progress, or if they have, had some struggles or setbacks or even failures in the steps. Either way, they are attending regular meetings with other people and they report on what's going on with them. So, which means that there's sort of a group accountability aspect of this.
Right. Another part of this is that the people in this program that are involved have to practice honesty and disclosure to a group of people who specifically acknowledge and praise their successes and honesty. And that, I think, is an important thing. Is sometimes people are going to mess up, but if they're being honest about it and they get praised and support around being honest, they're more likely to engage in more honest disclosures when they go into these meetings.
Yeah.
Like, it's sometimes very difficult to be very honest about something when that disclosure can result in a lot of harm or punishing contingencies around that disclosure.
Right.
Which is why, kids lie a lot. It's because when they do something and they're honest and they get in trouble, they're like, well, I could lie and not get in trouble, or I could be honest and maybe get grounded or in trouble that way. So it's nice to be in a space where honest disclosures get some kind of reward and support, even if it is somebody messing up.
Yeah, and it means that they can share about their successes because there's a certain vulnerability to, I have been dealing, there was this time that I really wanted to drink and I chose not to. And if you say that in front of a group of colleagues, they're like, whoa, you were trying to drink during that? And that's not the reaction they're looking for. The reaction they're looking for is the group of people saying, congratulations, that was a huge milestone. I know it must have been tough. And so they can sort of have that opportunity to receive acknowledgement for the success that it was without the judgment that would come from the context in which that decision may have been made.
Right.
Where I think other people might miss the important part. And I think understandably, if you were like a surgeon who's like, I was going to pull my bottle of vodka out right before the surgery and I decided not to. And everyone's like, you have a bottle of vodka in your desk?
Right.
They're like, but I didn't though. Understandable that they would get a lot more out of this group of people willing to acknowledge that as a victory for them.
Yeah, absolutely. People can also get a person assigned to them, which is they're called a sponsor. You've probably heard some version of that. And that person who has been successful in the program, and the person with the sponsor can turn to their sponsor for support whenever they need it, whenever they need some guidance around something, whenever maybe they have a disclosure that can't wait until the AA meeting. There's a lot of kind of support and almost like mentorship that happens in that relationship.
Yes, and then they might feel accountable to that sponsor of if I fail, that means that I failed my sponsor who's here for me. So I want them to be proud of my successes. And then it flips. So the person who's being successful under the guidance of their sponsor and through their attendance in the program, they could potentially get assigned a person that they sponsor. And then they feel responsible for that person's success, and they feel accountable to continue to demonstrate the success so that person sees this as I can do this too, because my sponsor has this, they're going through this and they're being successful. And so then the sponsor has that sort of sense of responsibility and ownership over somebody else. And so there's a really tight, super little, small, but I mean, it's a really important and meaningful social dynamic between those relationships.
Yeah, and speaking of social dynamics, the folks that are joining this program are actually disconnecting from social groups that would enable that high rate of alcohol consumption, if that's part of it, right? So they may remove themselves from those contexts, those situations, or those people, at least for the period of time while they're kind of recovering and getting some foundational skills around this, right? Doesn't mean they're cut off from them forever. It just means that they're kind of like removing themselves to build skills to go back to that ideally. And so what might happen is while they've removed themselves from the social groups, they're creating new connections with new social groups that not only enable alcohol abstinence or avoidance, but they actually can help them kind of stay out of those social activities to be in different new social activities that are alcohol free and kind of create some new learning histories around that too.
Yeah. Another aspect of this is these people who are members here, they go out, as we mentioned, as part of the 12 steps, they repent to the others that they feel that they have wronged. And they often do this by confronting them directly, or they might write them a letter, or they might do both of those things. But they specifically go face to face and talk to the people that they think that they have wronged in some way in relation to their alcoholism.
Yeah. And then, people pray a lot, are compelled to join other religious activities as part of it, which is, I think perfectly fine if that's something that works for you. And we'll kind of unpack some of that stuff. And then people are often recommended substitutions for their consumption habits. So figuring out some kind of replacement to fill that gap, because one, and we know this from like a behavioral perspective, when you remove a behavior that contacts so much reward, then you basically create this kind of like behavior vacuum, right? Like there's a response vacuum that happens, and that's going to be filled with either that skill that you got rid of, it's going to come back, or some other problematic skill. So teaching some like suitable consumption habits, replacement skills around this, it's going to be super important as part of this.
You got to think like when their solution in the past had been, drink for whatever the problem that they were facing was. Now, when they're faced with that problem again, what are they going to do? So having something else to do is really important. And I was kind of wondering, like, would we suffer adverse consequences by comparing the damage of alcoholism to advertisements? Let's find out. All right, we reached a really nice sort of segue point because we've been unpacking a sort of what's going on in the Alcoholics Anonymous sphere.
Right.
And again, a lot of this is information many of you will have known about, but there were certainly pieces that were details that I was less clear on until I was sort of, doing the specific reading on the aspect. But the critical, we're a science podcast. I think as much as we are a psychology podcast, we're a science dissemination podcast, or at least I'd like to believe that that's what we do, and hopefully I'm right. And so it's important then to actually dig into and evaluate what's the research say on all this.
Yeah, and really, I think a question that people would ask is, does this work? And if it does work, how do we tell if it works? And, it might seem like an obvious answer or an obvious approach, like maybe people are drinking less or they stop drinking altogether, people maintain their sobriety, or they have low levels of consumption. You might look at recidivism rates around this. I mean, you might look at group participation and what that looks like. I mean, there's a lot of different things that might be simple, I think, measures or outcomes related to this, but it is quite a bit more complicated than that, I think.
Yeah, and it sounds a lot simpler than it turns out that it can be for a variety of reasons that we'll get into. And let's start with the fact that there has been a lot of skepticism about the effectiveness of AA's programs pretty much since the beginning. Right. Very early on, people have sort of wondered, but like, does it really work? And I think an important feature here that I want to get into why this is so important and toward the end is that as recently as 2015, well-controlled scientific studies continued to report mixed results on the outcomes of attendees of AA. Further, the extent to which it might work was so unclear that it was basically opaque. I mean, and what I mean by that is like, you could not tell if there was anything that worked about Alcoholics Anonymous, what it was. Right. And we couldn't even tell if it worked better than doing nothing at all, better than other intervention programs, better than medication, better than therapy. Was it worse than those? It was really difficult. And most of the studies were really all over the place. You had some that said it was worse and some that said it was better.
Right. Which I think, when you're talking about something that you're trying to gather evidence for, that doesn't sound like evidence, because it's like your answers to a question could be multiple. And that, you know, I mean, we already know that from just like a basic human behavior standpoint that, you know, there's not a one size fits all type of circumstance. But if we're talking about like a pretty consistent effect, it didn't look like we were seeing that just yet. And what we found was that most research looked at how people who joined AA achieved sobriety. But that in itself is a complicated question. What does that mean? Are we talking about sobriety for one day? Are we talking about that they only drink alcohol in moderated amounts at irregular intervals? Does it mean complete abstinence? And if so, for how long? And what we actually kind of found was that, or what the studies found was that most of these studies looked at relatively short windows. We're talking 3 to 6 months was a pretty common measure, and it was all self-reported, which again, there's some issues with self-report data in general, but kind of as we unpack this, those are some things that we have to look at from the skeptical side going, okay, but still, what does this mean? What does this look like? And how are we gathering these data?
Exactly right. And how, to what extent can we accept the reports that were given as being good, accurate reports if someone feels really strongly about Alcoholics Anonymous, whether or not they've been successful? Maybe they contacted a piece of success that resulted in one really substantial, meaningful change for them. And even though they didn't maintain their sobriety, they want it to look good. And so they're asked, did this work for you? Are you sober? They might say, I'm sober enough to say yes.
Right.
I'm not as drunk as I have ever been. So yes, let's go with
Sure.
yes. You know,
sure.
And so I think you could imagine that would be the case if they don't have another way to like really clearly determine those sorts of things. And so there's a lot of different ways to ask these questions and try and determine the effectiveness of this. Some research looked at how long it maintained, but long compared to what? Like how long they maintained sobriety through AA compared to like using pharmaceuticals for their sobriety, how long they maintained it compared to other therapies, how long it maintained compared to just controlling it on your own. Like those might be very different comparisons to make, that some of them would show a less robust comparison and others might show a huge difference in comparison.
Right.
And so it's like, how well did people maintain their alcoholism when they also then picked up doing like heroin? Like not well, you know? So heroin, bad intervention, but we won't call it heroin. We'll just call not AA.
Right. And those are some complications. I mean, some other ones too. And I think it's important to note that the research up until this time was favorable for AA was generally self-report, self-selected, and conducted by groups who were generally biased toward AA. Like they actually found those programs to be really helpful, and they actually had like a particular leaning to that. Now, on the other side of that, research against was also generally self-reported, self-selected, but it was conducted by people who didn't really care about the outcome for AA, or like wasn't really in favor. So you can see kind of how biases might show up in this space, and in that regard makes it really complicated to kind of rifle through the results of the studies that have been done so far.
Now, recall that I said that this was up until about 2015, but in 2020, things changed. The most systematic and largest meta-analyses ever conducted to date was published that both weeded out weaker studies and included a lot more studies that were of sort of higher scientific rigor. And the conclusion was, drumroll please. All right, AA was somewhat effective. So in these, about 15 to 25% of people remained abstinent in non-AA groups compared to 22 to 37% in AA. So let me just say those numbers again. About 15 to 25% versus people in AA was 22 to 37%, which is higher. I mean,
yes,
that's not a slam dunk. It's not like 100% of people. It's not even 50% of people, but it is higher.
Yeah, it almost reads as like it's better than nothing.
Yeah, and these were in direct comparison to pretty much everything besides AA. So this was like nothing. It may have been other intervention programs. It may have been pharmaceuticals, but it was like AA compared to all the other things.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's promising at least. But again, I think there is the difficulty in how we're studying this. I mean, consider those who are approached to participate. If we are already being successful, then they might be more likely to agree to participate. And the pressure of participating in research might further influence them to gain and maintain sobriety. So there is kind of like that iatrogenic effect of the study that shows up and produces that type of outcome, right? Like, hey, I did a study. I said I was good. I want to keep that up. But people who are struggling to maintain sobriety may be less likely to want to participate in studies because maybe they're embarrassed about it. Maybe they're not at the stage where they're disclosing. Maybe they haven't hit that step yet, and they're not really prepared to do that. And because of that, questions that specifically ask about drinking may not get answered, or people who are still drinking but still participating in these programs are very unlikely to participate in studies like this.
And generally speaking, they want to have some kind of randomized assignment for people who are and who are not participating in AA so that they can weed out like what other elements may have brought them there, right? If it's randomized, then you should have an even mix of people with high and low motivations and like a variety of circumstances in each group. That's really difficult to do. They did have some studies that managed to pull that off, but it's important to consider that let's say someone ended up in a control group. You can't ethically or even practically ask the people in the control group not to seek help for their drinking.
Right.
And that could include them using AA if they wanted to do that. Right. So you might then say like they're in the control group and they're like, yeah, but I'm not going to wait around and like let this continue destroying my life. I want to take action and do something about it. And they might even go join AA as a way to do it. How do you control for that? You can't.
Right.
It would be unethical and inappropriate. Also, there are people who were in the AA group who then chose not to attend AA, and therefore it went undetected by the study. So how would they account for a lack of success when they're not part of the pool anymore, even though they're not being successful, even though they were assigned to that? So it makes it difficult then to be really clear on like what exactly was going on. And the range, so the number we gave you, those are sort of like the overall outcomes. The actual outcomes did differ quite a bit from study to study.
Right. And I think one thing, too, to account for is that we are talking about, and this is true for just about any sort of like drug counseling type of space or substance abuse type of space, where recidivism rates are fairly high or relapse rates are very high. Right. So like, I think, if you hear the number like, 22 to 37%, and you're thinking that's a pretty low number. Yeah, that's a pretty low number. But that number, those low rates of success compared to relapse are pretty consistent among most addiction programs. Just they vary, right? But there are typically pretty low success rates in general because relapse rates can be so high as a general rule. So I just want to kind of orient everybody to that as well as we start to explore some of the other things. And we'll talk more about those data in those specific contexts. But I think it's important to kind of give a little bit of frame on that too.
I think that's fair. And I also think it's, when we talk about numbers like this, I think we sometimes forget like these are people and their lives.
Right.
And we want to acknowledge and celebrate every life that is improved by a successful intervention is important and that it matters. So it's like just saying that like, yeah, but it wasn't, as many people, and we don't know what the factors around that always were, but the people who were successful, like when it was a larger number, like that matters. Like it is important, even if it's not like, as I said, it's not a slam dunk. It wasn't everybody who was able to work their way through it, but any success where we can find it, we want to acknowledge like those people, like those are people. And so we do want to sort of celebrate that to the extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, some other questions as we kind of unpack the research part are, questions about what about people who attend AA but get other support and treatment to manage their addiction? So maybe there's like what you could describe as multiple treatment effects. They might see a therapist, they may be prescribed medication, or they might do any other number of things that result in success that's completely unrelated to AA. So it might be that they're successful because they are in the AA program, but it might also be that there's an outside extraneous active ingredient that makes it look like AA is the thing that works really well,
Yeah, like let's say that they join AA, but they also joined a pickleball league and they don't drink alcohol before, during, or after playing pickleball. And so like that was actually the critical thing is they have a new group of friends that are promoting exercise that is like alcohol would be counterproductive to that. And they really enjoy their pickleball. And so now that is actually the thing that's the most effective at helping them achieve and maintain sobriety, even though they are also going to AA. That could happen.
Yeah, it could. Absolutely. Pickleball is the new intervention, I think.
Many people swear by the effectiveness of AA for themselves, and there are plenty of success stories out there. So what we're just trying to do is like say more than anything, how difficult it is to unpack the research here and to conduct the research, right? But it also, like, those numbers are clear that this is not for everyone. And probably most important, it's very unclear what part of the program is working when it does work. So
Right.
we'll need to talk about that here in just a second.
Right. And I think the other side too is like this idea of effectiveness, right? So if we were pointing out like that this was a highly effective program, or if this were a highly effective program, it wouldn't have taken so long to find that out. We would have had some good scientific evidence that is only, and the fact that it's only coming out just now, finding that there is a statistically significant difference, I think, and we can kind of argue, is pretty damning evidence about how either the research around this was conducted or whether or not this was a highly effective program. What we're kind of leaning on here and what the studies are saying is it's modestly effective for some people sometimes, you know, and again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there's a difference between kind of like spelling out like explicitly, hey, this doesn't work for everybody, but this seems to work for some folks really well. So like maybe consider that, versus going, this is the program to go to, period. Like the fact that there are court orders to go to these programs and stuff like that for a program that maybe works at close to 40% of the time, I think is a concern that we should look at.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's important to, I think, understand what the major caveats are, and that like a court-ordered recommendation that someone do this, I think you could say there's a 40% chance that that'll be an effective, strategy for them.
Right.
And even that, I think, is not a totally accurate characterization of what the math says. And so that's why part of what needs to what has happened and what needs to happen is starting to understand what does and doesn't work about this, which you'll have to wait for after these ads. Okay, so let's, I think, unpack, generally speaking, any kind of treatment addiction. Well, this is going to be primarily oriented around alcoholism and treatment for alcoholism, but there are aspects of this that are true for kind of anything. So let's start to unpack what works and what doesn't here.
As a general rule, there are three kind of domains or aspects of addiction recovery that are worth taking note of. There's detox, there's pharmaceuticals, and there's therapeutic support. And so I think when it comes to alcoholism, we have to talk about this idea of detox and what that means. And detox is not that thing where you go to the local smoothie place and get like a detox smoothie to feel better. Just to be clear, okay? Like that's what your liver
Wrap
does.
your body
and that's
in
what
seaweed and mud.
Yeah, like that's your body already does that. You got kidneys. What do you think your kidneys are for? Is all I'm saying. So detox, though, is a critically necessary component of any sort of addiction recovery, but it can be very dangerous, especially when it comes to alcohol. And it's rare, but people can die from alcohol withdrawal symptoms during their detox. I mean, I know this is not comparable, but I know that there are days when I don't have coffee in time and I feel terrible and like I mean my head hurts and like I can't it's awful, I can't imagine like this level. And like I said, I'm not comparing it, I'm just saying that like that is just a small taste of what some folks go through on like this higher intensity level. And so what this means, this detox process means, it means that it's a process that should always, without exception, be supervised by medical professionals or a team of trained medical support staff. And there are many low cost or even free programs around the country and in many countries around the world to support this detox stint that somebody has to go through, which may be anywhere from a couple days to maybe even a couple weeks. So I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. And that all depends on the severity of the substance that's being detoxed, and the severity of the addiction itself.
Right. Yeah. Another step is pharmaceuticals. And this one is a little bit trickier. I think filling people with pills can be dangerous. And you also could essentially just substitute one addiction for another if you're not being careful. But some of the most commonly accepted drugs for alcoholism that to support achieving sobriety include naltrexone, which is designed to reduce the pleasure that is derived from drinking. Disulfiram, I think is how you say that. People will have heard of this. The idea of this drug is that it's designed to cause nausea and discomfort when drinking, to essentially pair drinking with like extreme nausea and distaste.
Right.
And then the last one is acamprosate, I think is how you say that. which is designed to suppress alcohol cravings by essentially replacing neurologically the chemicals that would be associated with like alcohol seeking type behaviors. And so those are sort of the three different pharmaceuticals that might be prescribed to help people who are trying to kick the habit. An important piece of this, though, is to consider it depends on how people are using the alcohol.
Right.
Some abusers use it as a sleep aid. Okay. And in these cases, a sleep medicine is probably the best treatment option for them. Some people might use it for pain management. And so a better pain medicine, possibly other medical intervention, we're not trying to get people hooked on opiates here, might be a more appropriate type of medication is to help them manage their pain in a different way. And so like it's worth considering what role the alcohol fills chemically and medically that people are using it for that is then the thing to replace it with, because it may not be that you want something that mimics the effects of alcohol or makes it taste disgusting, because they might even fight through that if the motivation is to overcome their pain. Right. So just I think it's important to understand contextually and functionally how it's being used.
Right. Absolutely. There's also that third level, which is the therapeutic support. And many people are able to successfully quit drinking by just committing to the change through some type of support. But most people need or would at least benefit from having someone to talk to, just as a general rule, not even in addictions, right? Outside of that, people just generally have, they benefit from having somebody to talk to who they can seek help from and having them navigate feelings, but especially in addiction, navigating feelings and thoughts they're having around their use of substance of choice or seeking that, or triggers around what might be causing those cravings or that need. And so therapy is a good idea in general for most, if not all people, just as a general rule, but also especially for folks who are kind of managing and kind of navigating recovery, because recovery is a long, bumpy process that is going to have a lot of U-turns and detours, and having somebody to kind of help guide through that is incredibly helpful.
Yeah. Okay, now we've been talking about sort of just treatment for addiction, generally speaking. So we haven't actually gotten into the AA part. Okay, so coincidentally, when we're trying to figure out what parts of AA work, most people don't totally know, but a lot of the researchers have like a suggestion for what they think is probably going on, and they pretty much all independently agree on what that is. Coincidentally, AA actually has some features that are found in other forms of scientifically validated effective treatments for other types of addiction, notably identifying a replacement for consumption, which we talked about, getting a different social support group, which we've talked about, right, being accountable to someone else, and frequent acknowledgments for successfully maintaining new habits. This actually can include non-chemical addictions to behavioral addictions, which we'll talk about in later episodes. It's like AA kind of landed on those sort of convergently outside of like the plan that they had in place. That is a thing that kind of works in general, and so it'll kind of work here.
This has actually been supported by other research too. The number one most effective part of AA is almost certainly the social support aspect, which we've talked about in our episode about Armageddon, how humans tend to be social creatures and we need that social support. So that social support piece it seems like that's the active ingredient. And that is what we're saying specifically in the AA context is extricating people from social groups and situations that tend to facilitate and encourage drinking, and replacing those social groups with social groups and situations that do not include and possibly even discourage drinking, and reinforce and reward those situations where you actively choose not to, and the successes around that, and also the validation piece around that. So having the social group that kind of like is aligned with your desired outcome really can make a difference here.
Another important social aspect of this is that sponsor sort of mentor-mentee relationship we talked about. Now, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to engineer that kind of relationship dynamic that's created in the sponsor to new member relationship from AA, in that is sort of like a go to the doctor, they prescribe you a sponsor type thing. That probably wouldn't work very well, right?
Right.
But what's going on here, as we mentioned, is like this is being held accountable to someone who depends on your success for their own success, and that is plenty effective in other circumstances, right? think of like other places where this versions of this kind of exist. You see this in training for team sports can work in this way, where like you're accountable to the other people on your team or to your coach or to someone on the team who's sort of taking you under the wing. Advisor and student relationships can work this way. When you go to school and when you go to college or grad school, that someone who's sort of there who like they are then responsible for you. And so it helps keep them accountable to staying on top of their research and conducting themselves in an ethical manner. And we know that that doesn't always happen, but that is going to be true in the sponsor relationship to their mentee sometimes as well. Like the sponsor could fall off the wagon, but it seems that, and more often than not, that kind of dynamic works for both people. The person who's responsible for the new person and the person who feels accountable to their sponsor. And plenty of examples have demonstrated how effective it can be to be responsible for someone and have them depend on you as a reason to do or not to do something. Yeah. And I think of also training for the Olympics. Like you've got a coach who you sort of feel obligated to them and they feel obligated to you. So we engineer these, we kind of don't engineer, but we create these dynamics in a lot of situations. And we find that can be a very powerful way to motivate a particular type of behavior change that sometimes feels almost impossible when you're first doing it, when you're first training for the Olympics, or you're first picking up a brand new habit, or you're trying to kick some physical dependency to a substance that you've used can feel impossible at first. But we've seen people overcome this by having that responsibility and accountability to someone who's there for them.
Absolutely. Now, as part of this, we mentioned before there's a Christian-leaning kind of faith-based approach to some of the structure of this, and that means that prayer may be included. And prayer can actually be an effective behavior change procedure for some people in some situations. I mean, there are studies on magical mans and what that means. This is kind of like for our behavior nerds out there, like I think that's kind of a fun thing to explore. The problem with prayer is that it's wildly unpredictable about how effective it will ever be and can even go the opposite direction for some folks. And it's unlikely an important part of why AA works for the vast majority of folks. In and of itself, prayer does not always produce the overall outcome or reward that people expect. And so because of that, it's kind of haphazard or kind of creates almost like I don't want to degrade for folks that find prayer powerful. I don't want to like diminish that. Yeah. But ultimately, every one of your prayers does not get reinforced, and the ones that do get reinforced or rewarded are kind of variable at best. And so by itself as an intervention does not work as consistently effectively as some other parts of this.
And some people will see it as I did my time praying, now I don't have to change my behavior. Right. And so that's where it can be counterproductive. So we're kind of now moving on. We're sort of trying to cover the spectrum of what works and what doesn't, starting with the most powerful thing, which is a change in your social structure, to the least powerful thing. And I think so prayer is kind of a wild card. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The next step in here is this expressing regret and guilt and doing a penance to others. This is likely completely ineffective. There's really no evidence that this has ever been a long-term strategy for successful behavior change, is going over rehashing all the things you've ever done wrong. Right. Like we've never seen that work anywhere else. So it's unlikely that that's actually an important part of any of the aspects of the intervention. And likely, if you threw it out, not only there would be no change in outcomes at worst, there'd be no change, So yeah.
Another one of the less effective strategies is the sharing and hearing from other struggles as like a part of like a group exercise, right? So a 2023 report suggested that as many as 40% of new members to AA actually leave after just the first meeting because the horror stories people share are so depressing, disheartening, and even traumatic to hear. And then sharing their own stories makes people relive some of the worst and most harrowing events of their lives in gruesome detail. And this can actually motivate people to self-medicate with the thing that they usually use to feel better, alcohol. So they kind of leave those and they go, oh, that was so bad, I got to have a drink. And that in itself is kind of like what they found is sharing and hearing isn't really the thing, at least in the group setting, is not the thing that's helpful here. Like maybe having a sponsor and being able to have your feelings validated and those experience validated and stuff like that part might be the helpful part. Yeah. But doing the sharing and hearing in the group context is not the thing that works for folks.
And when that works, that often is an effective part of a therapeutic relationship with a trained therapist. Like just going over the shotgun approach to a bunch of strangers that are not trained therapists, they don't know how to react to that kind of thing. Oftentimes it's just sympathy. Sometimes it's trying to give you advice. A trained therapist is someone who knows how to engage with and direct that kind of verbal exchange so that it can be productive. These other spaces, you don't know what you're going to get, and it can actually be very counterproductive to essentially re-experience that trauma again.
Right.
If you don't have someone who's there to be a support. So in a therapeutic context, that might and very likely will be an aspect of it. In this context, probably dangerous, right?
Right.
Like I would strongly actually encourage that they take that aspect of it out. The sharing can instead be things like sharing how you were faced with a situation and like, this is how the choice I made to overcome that. That whole group acknowledgement of celebrating and acknowledging your victories can be good. But this whole just like, here are all the terrible things I've done and all the people I've hurt can just be really horrific.
Right. And I imagine there's probably been some shift on that if they're responding to people leaving, right? Like, I mean, if AA is a responsible program, like if they're a responsive program, then they're going, whoa, our membership is going down and we're noticing that people are leaving after this first meeting. I wonder why. Maybe we need to kind of structure our sharing to mostly share successes or share like kind of overcoming barriers. It might not necessarily be a success on its face, but it might be just like, hey, here's how I overcame this particular issue, which is something that was historically a problem for me. And that might be a better way to go about that without having to re-trigger or distress anybody else in that space.
Yeah. And I don't know if they are. I would say typically I expect any organization that's foundation is primarily religious to ignore they usually forge ahead in the absence of evidence.
Sure.
and so I don't know. But it's possible. They did land on some effective strategies and presumably because they worked. It is possible. Now, the last thing we'll talk about here. So arguably the least effective and probably even counterproductive part of AA is this aspect that is actually step number 1 in the program. And this is the imbuing people with the notion that they lack control. Yeah. You would think like, I don't even understand the logic of this one. You would think that the better strategy would try to be to empower people to believe that they can and do have the control to be able to direct their behavior in a more value-driven direction. Right. That is a very common approach to other behavior trained strategies. And the other thing that's confusing about this is this isn't even contradictory to a religious orientation and specifically a Christian one. You can be empowered to pray to God for help with controlling your behavior, or see God as delivering you to have the control to change your behavior. In many of these religious circles, they like to say, God helps those who help themselves, right? And so like, I don't even understand the logic of this piece of it, of like saying you don't have the control, but change your behavior anyway. Right. That doesn't make any sense. So I think that piece of it, which weirdly is like step number 1 in the program, is shooting themselves in the foot. Like what they do have that might be effective is probably being actually tamped down by this aspect and some of the others we've mentioned, like this traumatic reliving of terrible events.
Yeah, I'm wondering if like a revision to that would be more useful, where it's something like, it's not necessarily that's out of your control, like it is in your control, but something has happened and you've lost control. So now we're working to regain it. Or maybe a better way to say it is, it's not your fault. So like, it's fine. Not your, it's not your fault and things can get better with action, right? Like, and that is like talking about that values-based going forward type of piece. I think, by saying it's out of your control also gives people the ability to go, well, it's not my fault. It's out of control this way. And like, I can't do nothing about it. I don't know why. I'm just assuming this AA group is in New York, but
yes, or New Jersey. Yeah.
Or New Jersey or wherever. Like, oh, dude, I can't do nothing about it. Dude. But I was thinking about that and I was like, I feel like a better way to go about it is saying like, you are not an alcoholic, but this is maybe, I'm just thinking of like behavioral ways to say this that would be so much more empowering and building that foundation of like this, you have the strength to do this thing. Yeah. Your context can change.
Yeah, you're not a bad person. This is not like you don't have to be this way. There are ways that you can take back the reins and choose alternatives that are different to where you're at and like get on a path that makes more sense for what you'd like your life to be.
And I think that the sentiment's there. I think that's the sentiment of what they're trying to say there. But I think the way they're saying it might be a problem, you know?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cause you're right that like, I think they probably were meaning that like, this wasn't on you that you developed this problem, but the phrasing is like you don't have control again is like it's counterproductive to the notion of having people gain control,
right?
And actually, you know, it's kind of ironic that like Bill Wilson even sort of mentioned or talked about like part of his inspiration was that he had lost control, and then like his solution is I don't have control, and I'm like, connect those dots for me, please. I'm like,
right.
Where? Anyway, point being, you're right, that there is probably a more productive way that we could probably phrase that. And I get that that's probably the sentiment that we're going for, but it just seems like this is not the direction I would recommend that they take on.
Right. Agreed.
We've been at this so long. We do have a bit more. We'll have to do that after the ads. We love busting myths here on this show, and there are some sort of myths about AA and around AA that I think are worth unpacking. Some of them are completely wrong. Some of them are a little misguided, but there's just three primary ones that I thought were kind of interesting for us to unpack.
Yes, the first myth that we would like to bust is that there is no alternative to AA. There are actually several secular addiction support groups for a wide range of specific or general addiction problems, including the Secular Organizations for Sobriety, the SOS. You can find that at sossobriety.org. There's also Smart Recovery, and there's also LifeRing.
There is Women for Sobriety, Rational Recovery, and then Moderation Management. I think that's just a small handful of what's out there. Those are just the ones that came up the most frequently when I was looking at what alternatives exist.
Yeah, and they all seem to contain similar elements or the same elements around kind of what AA has got. The same ones that are effective for achieving and maintaining sobriety, but they also go forward without having that religious orientation. So if you're somebody who is worried about that and you're seeking that help, then just know there are options that do not have that religious kind of bent to it.
Yeah, and there are also other religious-based groups that just are not AA that are designed to help support achieving and maintaining sobriety. So like if you did want to go the religious route but didn't like what they were doing at AA, you could try some of those other religious organizations that support that. Like there are tons of options. This specific myth was, I mean, there are plenty of people who have propagated this, but one in particular, Jordan Peterson, was asked why AA was successful, and he said, well, there's nothing else out there. I'm like, wow, hard to imagine wrapping my head around just saying something so blatantly wrong without even taking a second to think about it. But I mean, that's kind of his whole thing. So
yeah, that's why he's the mortal enemy of the show.
Yeah, real on brand for him anyway. So there are alternatives to AA, both religious and secular. There's actually many of them, all of them free, all of them open to people who need to attend. So like look into some options. We mentioned some, but there's plenty out there. You do not have to go with AA if that's not your particular orientation. And for some people it will be, and for some people it won't.
Well, and on top of that, and we'll talk about this in the next episode for sure, there are some healthcare programs in the United States that have opened up accessibility to treatment programs that might be more specific to facilities and not necessarily AA or like an outsourced nonprofit program. There might be some inpatient programs that might work pretty well too. So that include like things like detox pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. So, but we'll talk more about kind of how that showed up in the next episode. Another myth is that total abstinence is critical for success. And that's just not the case.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a pretty tall order. Alcohol is ubiquitous in our world, much to my personal chagrin. Mm-hmm. Like, we've talked about how I feel about alcohol on the show plenty enough. And the thing is, like, I acknowledge that it's really difficult to say you need to go all the way the opposite direction and completely cut this out of your life. Most people navigate life managing their consumption of alcohol at totally reasonable levels, right? Titrating this down to complete zero may be a lot harder than just moderating their intake instead.
Right.
And to be fair, for some people, they suck at moderation. I'm actually one of those. Like, I tend to be like, if I'm going to do something, I go all in on it. If I'm like, if I'm going to try dieting, I'm like, I'm not going to eat for a whole week. Like that's like no exceptions type person. And I struggle with moderation. So I'm actually a lot better at all or nothing type deals. But for a lot of people, I think moderation is a more effective strategy to use.
I think about this a lot. My brother has never had alcohol, and he avoids it because he's worried about addiction and he's worried about family history and stuff. So he's like, for him, total abstinence is very easy for him.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He's like, no thanks, don't want it, right? We have different views on that. I think growing up in the straight edge and the straight edge hardcore scene made it very easy to abstain, but you also see people who, like the people who are no longer straight edge from the scene that I grew up in, had a harder time with moderation once they decided not to be straight edge, unfortunately.
Exactly right. Yeah. There's like a lack of opportunity to practice. And it might be more effective to actually just help reshape people's relationship to alcohol rather than trying to eliminate it altogether.
Right.
And I think that a lot of programs are specifically oriented to instead moderation and like a slowly titrating down to a lower level than they are to going, complete cold turkey or just even gearing toward abstinence. Total abstinence does not always have to be the goal. Like I said, for some people it is. I would be one of them. It sounds like your brother is one of them, and that's totally fine. But I think that is not always the most appropriate route to try and go. As you said with the example, like straight edge kids, like people who do go totally abstinent, if they fall off the wagon, they fall hard,
Yeah.
It is not like, I had the one drink. It's like, well, I had the drink. May as well do the whole keg while I'm here.
Right. I got to make up for lost time.
Yeah. So it can be difficult. So I think sometimes working on moderation is a much better strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the final myth that we're going to bust is that it's about the serenity prayer. So the serenity prayer can actually be traced back to the wisdom of ancient philosophers. It's not just a uniquely AA thing. The serenity prayer is actually very common in AA. It's so common that you might actually think that they wrote it. So AA actually have assumed that it was written by any number of ancient philosophers because it sounds so wise. And you'll actually recognize it. It goes, quote, God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and wisdom to know the difference, end quote. So you've probably heard you've either heard that or you've heard some version of that somewhere.
Yeah. Now they have sort of talked about and written about these were these ancient famous philosophers back in the day. Actually, these words were written by German American and Christian ethicist and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. That's my attempt at that.
That was good.
Thank you. Who lived 1892 to 1971. His original 1932 prayer, just 3 years before AA was founded, was slightly different, but pretty close. So as you said, the prayer that most people hear is, quote, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. What Niebuhr actually wrote, was, quote, God give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, end quote.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. But he also wrote hundreds or even thousands of such prayers and did not seem to think that this was a particularly special prayer. So could you imagine that, where it's like this thing is getting used as like a hallmark for a program, and this guy's like, yeah, I don't even remember writing that.
Yeah, that was basically what happens too.
I've done that. I've written stuff and I'm like, I don't even remember saying that or writing that. So I see how it could happen.
The YMCA also borrowed his prayer in 1936, but they put their own spin on it. So their version goes, quote, oh God, give us courage to change what must be altered, serenity to accept what cannot be helped, and insight to know the one from the other, end quote. So you can see that like his sentiment, I think, really registered with a lot of people, and they really like the sort of, I think the cadence of it and the expression of the theme. There's like a little bit of like a almost comedic quippiness to it.
Sure.
That I think resonates with people, but it's so couched in like religious orientation that I think anybody who is of that faith is going to hear it and be like, awesome, love this so much. Anyway, just a fun thing to know is like that was actually written in 1932, just barely preceding the founding of AA itself.
I actually really like the sentiment, like the idea of like thinking about like, okay, like some things got to change and I've got to be brave enough to change it. Some things I can't change and I've got to be able to accept that. And I got to be able to know the difference between the two. Like that is actually like a pretty decent outlook on life. I think it's actually pretty great, but it doesn't work for me as like a driving motivator. Like, I'm not going to go, okay, here we go. But like, it's a nice thought. Kind of, I put that on the same pedestal as like something like where Kurt Vonnegut would say, and we are here on Earth to fart around. Don't let anybody tell you any different. Like, to me, it's like just kind of like a nice like orientation to kind of like a philosophy or a thought that you can kind of get behind,
Yeah, totally. Well, this one has gone quite long, which is no surprise. We're unpacking the behemoth that is AA, so we kind of knew it was going to be a bigger one. But I think that's what we more or less have to say about AA. There's obviously a lot more unpacking that could happen, but I think that we've covered essentially what we wanted to cover to be able to talk about how this affects people psychologically, what the alternatives are, what we think is going on in some of these, and what the research says. And I hope that we have accomplished that sufficiently today.
I think the only thing I would say to end that would be that if you find AA helpful or have found AA helpful, we'd love to hear from you and love to hear your experience or thoughts on that. I don't think there's anything wrong with finding something useful if it improves your quality of life and moves you in a direction that is away from the things that were harmful for you or other people. So like, while this is not 100% effective, if you have found it effective, then that's really truly what matters.
Absolutely.
If your quality of life has improved because of this, then by all means do this.
Yeah, do the thing that works for you. If it's AA, great. If it's something else, we'd love to hear that too. You should reach out to us directly. You can email us at info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach us on the other social media platforms and share your stories. We're happy to hear those. We would like to acknowledge you and others for the victories that they've had and help point you towards, the resources that we mentioned earlier for those of you who are looking for those. So this is a thing that people want to help people with this particular issue, both around alcohol and other substance abuse addictions. And we'll talk even further about some of these down the road as we go, because there's so much to unpack with addiction, and we're sort of just barely into our journey so far. But we've taken a step or two. We're moving. It's coming along.
Right. Absolutely.
We do want to recommend some things, but first I'd like to acknowledge that if you would like to support us on this show, as I said, you can join us on Patreon. If you do that, you'll get all kinds of bonus content, such as I'm about to read a list of people who have done this. So our group of awesome people includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate you.
So much more than you know.
So much. Also, I'd like to thank my team, the people who helped make this show happen. Writing and fact-checking from Shane and myself. Audio production and engineering from Justin. And our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. Think there's anything else, I said, reach out to us, join us, support us. Other ways you can support us is you can pick up merch from our merch store. You can leave us a rating and a review. Give us those nice 5 stars. It gives you the warm fuzzies when you do that.
It does.
You can tell a friend and be like, hey, check out this awesome podcast. You will be so happy that I told you, and we'll be even better friends. And that is universally the effect that has.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want better friendships, tell everybody about us.
Anyway, is there anything that I forgot or anything that you'd like to add before we talk about recommending some things?
No, I think that covers it.
Recommendations.
I'm recommending a movie that came out, I want to say 2023. This is called The Creator, starring John David Washington, Gemma Chan, Ken Watanabe, I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, Sturgill Simpson, Madeline Univoyles, and Allison Janney. This one was nominated for, but I don't think won an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. It is an incredible looking movie. How would I describe this? Did you see this one?
I didn't, but I saw some of the marketing stuff, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, this is a movie about the future of AI, where AI is trying to live in harmony alongside humans, and many humans want to basically declare war on AI. And so it's kind of about some human stories at the center of that war, but it plays out in the context of the war of humans versus AI. And the humans that are allied with the AI is kind of an interesting wrinkle in there too. So it's a pretty interesting movie, and I just visually very incredible. I was really impressed with the effects. The performances were all really good. I enjoyed it. So I'm recommending checking out The Creator. At the time, I believe this is currently streaming on Hulu that we're recording this. It's possible that this is available on other platforms. It's a 20th Century Fox thing, so maybe it'll be on Disney Plus, or maybe it already is. But yeah, so that's The Creator.
Yeah, it's on my list to watch. I heard it was actually pretty decent. So
Yeah, it was good.
My recommendation is a movie that just came out in theaters, and I think it is a blast. As a child of the 80s, I cannot help but love so much this franchise. And that is the new Ghostbusters movie, and it's called Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. So this is a direct sequel to Afterlife. If you've seen Afterlife, that one takes place in Oklahoma, which is very different for a Ghostbusters movie because all of them take place in New York.
Right.
Frozen Empire brings it back. It's all back in New York. And I think this one introduces some really cool concepts that are a little bit different than what we've seen so far. So this one introduces the concept of like, what if the Ghostbusters had financial backing?
Oh.
For those of you who hadn't seen Afterlife, Winston is a multi-billionaire now. He started a company and has this global kind of like business. And now he is bankrolling the Ghostbusters, including research initiatives. So this movie introduces things like the engineers. So they're Ghostbusters that are not out going and busting ghosts. They're in a research lab studying ghosts, studying technology, developing new things for the Ghostbusters. And I think that's one of the coolest things because it gives them an opportunity to do some really creative things that you couldn't do in the originals because you only had 4 guys who were fired from college busting ghosts, right? So really cool concepts, does a really good job of tying it back to the old movies. The main cast from the original movies play a huge role in this, Winston being the bankrolling financier and Ray Stantz, Dan Aykroyd's character, being like a really great consultant for the new Ghostbusters. And man, it was a lot of fun. It was just so fun and just like, such a funny movie. And Paul Rudd is a great Ghostbuster, and just the kids in it are really good. Slimer's back. It's everything you want a Ghostbusters movie to be, you know?
Wow, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, we went very long on this one, but that was great. I'm looking forward to seeing that movie. I'm glad that you're giving it your thumbs up because that makes me want to see it even more.
Yay.
I think we should say our goodbyes. Anything else we need to add or anything I forgot before we wrap up today?
Nope, that's it for today.
All right, thank you all for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.